justices have missed completely, which is that historically pregnancy and childbirth and all of that was dealt with in the women's quarters, you know, and men didn't even, you know, and that goes on through history. I mean, as modern medicine developed and got more and more, learned more and more things about different diseases and how to fix different things, their priority was not on becoming OBGYNs. You know, the whole science of medicine was developed around fixing men's war wounds and doing all those things. And it was very late to the game that since all the doctors were male and they didn't know anything more about women giving birth than any woman did in things, so they just kind of left it there for a long time. Yeah, it wasn't really good for women, for men to get involved in childbirth, at least for a long time. I mean, maybe it's gotten better, I don't know, but yeah, exactly. That's, all cultures have midwives. It's just some have a patriarchal attitude toward them that says that the doctors know more than the midwives do. It's maybe true in a few cases. Okay, so this book kind of goes chronologically through ancient stuff up to modern stuff and comes to some conclusions at the end. And so I decided that we'd start with the conclusions and work our, it's like eating dessert first. So these are some of the things I learned and or kind of cemented my understanding of from reading this book. Number one, it's all about patriarchy. Enough said. Number two, which I will spend a lot of time talking about, is there's a Catholic pro-life movement and there is a white evangelical pro-life movement. And they're very different things. And they are strategically aligned in order to get something close to a majority of people. Not that they actually get there, but they're really together more for the politics than for, there's some things, alignments. We'll talk about that. And number three is that the Dobbs decision, the one that overturned Roe v. Wade, is fundamentally flawed because constitutional fundamentalism, which they call originalism, is fundamentally flawed because the Constitution is an Enlightenment document that was part of the Enlightenment, which was to stop relying on kings and priests to be the authority figures, and our job is just to obey them, but the idea that all people have God-given rights that even kings and priests can't take away. And I think Brandon Scott, the author, at one point says, if these people had been around during the revolution, they'd have been loyalists, not revolutionaries. They're thinking of, by saying, oh no, there's no expanding rights here, there's only what's exactly written here, and our job is to figure out, you know, the exact literal meaning of the Constitution and follow that, not to expound on it and bring it forward and find more light ever in the Constitution. So there's some conclusions. Now we'll go back and look at a few of these points. Starting with a few general notes about context. In our language, we're used to using two different words, abortion and miscarriage, as if they're two different things. English is unusual in that regard. So when we're interpreting old biblical texts or Roman texts or, you know, anything that come from other languages, chances are they're dealing with a single word for ending a pregnancy. And so there's some, you know, the notion that there are voluntary ends to pregnancies and medically necessary or, naturally occurring ends to pregnancy are two completely different things. It's kind of encouraged by the way our language works, but I think we're starting to maybe understand that there's a continuum there, and it's not just black and white on that. Second context point is, until modern medicine, abortion was more dangerous than childbirth because the methods that were available for abortion usually involved some sort of poison, was sort of the main way to do it. And so in some ways, talking about how people looked at abortion 2,000 years ago is utterly irrelevant, because abortion 2,000 years ago was a completely different act than it is today. Modern medicine has completely changed that. And to some extent, our modern struggle with the abortion issue is part and parcel to the fact that we now have safe ways to do it, and it's now safer, much, much safer to abort a pregnancy than it is to carry it to birth. A corollary to that is, if you go back to ancient Greek and Roman times, the number one way to get rid of an unwanted pregnancy was to give birth and then expose the child. In other words, the preferred method of reproductive control was actually infanticide. Who knew? Okay. Point 3, the Bible says nothing about abortion. There are some people who try to make certain things in the Bible apply to the abortion issue, but unlike all the other issues that evangelical Christians harp on, like homosexuality and so forth, and even slavery or, segregation, you can find something in the Bible that sort of supports it. The Bible doesn't really talk about abortion at all. There's, in the Hebrew law in Exodus, I bring this up mostly because it's just kind of amusing. There's one thing that mentions terminating a pregnancy or an ending a pregnancy in all of the law, all of the Torah, and it says when two men are fighting, and in the process, a woman is hit and it causes a miscarriage, then what do you do? So, I mean, it's interesting that the only mention of anything about miscarriage or abortion in the ancient law of Judaism is when two men are fighting and that accidentally causes a woman to abort a pregnancy. So what do you mean? Who gets blamed for it? Well, yeah, because it is an offense against the husband. The woman really has nothing to do with this discussion at all. Yeah, so the man causing the offense has to pay money to the other man to make up for this. Yeah, the woman's not and really another kind of contextual thing is that in these ancient writings, generally the way pregnancy worked, kind of the metaphor for pregnancy was planting a seed in the soil. Everybody's a farmer, right? So farming is what people understand, and so that was the metaphor that worked. The male seed gets planted in the womb, which is the field, the fertile field, and child grows until it can be harvested. You know, that was sort of the, and of course in that system, that seed and that growing plant belong to the man, and the woman is just the vessel, just the raised bed. I mean, I don't know what the right metaphor is here today. And the last bit about context is, like in the fresco at the beginning, the understanding that pregnancy, childbirth, and everything that goes with that happened in women's world. Women's history didn't get written down. So there is actually little known, little actual stuff around there. There's, you know, found some like letters from a man to another man saying, there's one from a man to his wife. The man's gone off somewhere to do something and finds out that his wife is pregnant. And he's writing to his wife to say, if the child is a girl, expose it. If it's a boy, keep it. But there's so few examples of that writing. You know, you don't know if that's typical or because we just don't have a lot of historical stuff about how all this happened through the centuries. Okay, anybody want to ask a question or make a comment before we jump into patriarchy? Okay, let's talk about patriarchy. I found this interesting because it's a much more expansive description of what patriarchy means. I always pictured it as kind of it means that men lord it over women, but that's only a piece of it. It's a whole hierarchical understanding of life. And this is Aristotle's chain of being. You know, how the things, as you go farther to the top of this list, things are more spiritual, more important, higher status, more important, and then they have they are master over, you know, whatever is below them. So, and the defining, that last line, the household's basic unit is master and slave, not husband and wife. So in a Roman or Greek or Roman household, where all of these things existed, it was the master-slave relationship that sort of defined everything, and you were in total control. So a man's relationship with his wife was very akin to a master-slave relationship. Jumping ahead to the New Testament, we find that there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament that people like to quote when it comes to issues of patriarchy and husbands and wives and how churches should be run and households should be run and so forth. And granted, I'm jumping a lot because I don't want to spend a lot of time in ancient history, but this is a really important point, which is that there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament of letters of Paul, letters that Paul actually wrote, and letters that were attributed to Paul or even claimed to be by Paul, but said something kind of like totally different from what Paul said. And so, as you can imagine, in certain circles of kind of fundamentalist Christianity, there is an absolute insistence that, yes, books like Ephesians were written by Paul, whereas amongst more liberal scholars who say absolutely it was not because it absolutely contradicts everything that Paul ever said. So we know that that first quote from Galatians is some of the oldest writing of Paul's. And in fact, we had a lecture series here a couple years ago with Dr. Steve Patterson, and he wrote a whole book about how this was like the oldest known Christian creed, was that there's no longer slave or free, no longer male and female. And interesting, the quotes in that, no longer male and female, is sort of a reference to the creation story where it says God, male and female, created he them. And that phrase had been misused in such a way that made males much more important than females. And so when it says there's no longer male and female, there's kind of a direct hit on the traditional way of interpreting the creation story. And then if you get to the Ephesians passage, wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. Does that sound suspiciously like a hierarchical way of looking at the universe? The writer of Ephesians has taken the traditional chain of being hierarchical way of looking at things and applied it to the church and put Christ in the church and things in here, while emphasizing the importance of husbands being masters of their wives. So that really muddies up the way people interpret the New Testament around patriarchy, because it's kind of there, but some of it was added later. And to complicate it further, there are places in the real letters of Paul where some editor has inserted something. And he gives an example of it in the book, is in 1 Corinthians, where Paul's writing something about, now when you're doing worship, do this and do this and do this, and then right in the middle of that passage, there's one, but never let women speak. And it's very clearly an insertion, but if you're a biblical literalist, you will look at that and go, see, Paul even said, don't let women speak in church. Well, it's just a paragraph that does not belong there, but it was obviously added.
And this was before AI. Just pointing that out. We've had this problem forever.
Yes, this was before AI. I've got a microphone for people that want to make comments. Otherwise, I'll just repeat what you said. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of that even in the New Testament. It took a long time for the collections of Paul's writings to become the New Testament, and lots of time for people to mess with them along the way. Okay. So, anything more people want to talk about with patriarchy? It will come back in our discussion of Roman Catholic history, and even in evangelical history. Well, we're getting to this. We're getting to this slide now. Okay, I just wanted to see if we talked about patriarchy enough. Okay, so Christianity sort of comes into form most completely around the time Constantine takes it over in 313 or whatever that was. And before that, it was very sort of undefined. So Saint Augustine of Hippo, was the first real theologian of the Christian church after it formed into its imperial form as part of the Roman Empire. And he talked about a lot of stuff that became a really critical foundational part of what we would now call Roman Catholicism. Some of it the Protestants got away from, some of it's still around. Augustine was Augustine had a lot of problems with sex and the whole notion of lust, and didn't really like it all that much. I think he'd had an unhappy life. So he gave us things like original sin, the idea that we're all born from lust, and therefore we're all sinful when we're born. He also got us the notion of the soul. Now, other people had talked about that. I think Aristotle and some of those said human beings have souls, but it was not a well-defined notion. But the notion that a human being is a body with a soul, and those are kind of two different things. And so that somewhere in the process of creating a human being, that human being gets a soul. And that's what the word ensoulment means. When did you get your soul? And so Augustine says a number of things, but he says, I know that I have a soul, but I don't know when I got it. He didn't even try to answer that question. There were others who said, kind of tried to make it hierarchical and saying, well, there's, back to the chain of being, there's different kinds of soul. There's plant souls, and then there's animal souls, and then there's, human souls. I guess maybe male souls are more important than female souls. Anyway, and that as the seed grows in the womb, that it actually kind of goes from being, a vegetable to an animal to a human. That was, I think, Tertullian, or one of those early folks. So it was really sort of an unanswered question back there, but in order for all of that theology to work, that human beings have souls, there has to be some moment where a human being becomes a human being by getting a soul. Whether that was at birth or at quickening was a common way of understanding it, that by the time you could actually feel the child move, then it must be a real child, and so it must have a soul. Ironically, Augustine also gave us sort of the notion that the soul is eternal, and therefore there will be a final resurrection. It wasn't really heaven and hell at that point. It was more there will be a resurrection of the dead, where the good will be raised from the dead. And he struggled with the notion that since, he said, well, I've now defined babies as being born in sin and therefore not saved until they're baptized, and now you're asking me, what about a baby who dies before they have any possibility of being baptized by like miscarriage or abortion? And he never really came up with an answer for that. There were sort of difficult things that I'd say the church is still wrestling with. At some point in there, they invented limbo, as a place for unbaptized babies to go because they were conceived in sin, but they hadn't actually had a chance to fix that. Let's jump ahead a few thousand years. And you give this character Pius IX, who was the longest person who's ever served as Pope. He served from 1846 to 1878. Was that 32 years? That's a long time for a Pope. And it happened right at the time some of the revolutions were still going on. The Italian Revolution forced him to move out of Rome for a while. He became very anti-revolutionary, anti-modern in his thinking. And he wrote a lot of stuff that became kind of enshrined and kind of defines what the modern Roman Catholic Church believes and does. And he kind of said, he basically said, well, Christians have always considered abortion a sin all the way back to Jesus from the moment of conception. As basically basically used his authority to say, this is our tradition, and from tradition, we're going to say that this has always been true, even though it hadn't always been true. It really had never been true. So that's kind of where the modern Catholic position came from.
I was just going to ask, is Pius the one also who said whatever I say is the truth? And,
He did kind of, the infallibility of the Pope. Yeah, I'm not a real expert on that, but I understand that it was, he had a lot to do with that idea being enshrined in Catholic thinking going forward. Brandon Scott does say something about it. There's only certain types of edicts of the Pope that are considered infallible, and nothing that Pius ever said about abortion or birth control or any of those things are kind of in that category, but his writings kind of were given that air of authority and permanence that has stuck with him. And the next important piece is the 1960s. We start having Vatican II, and things start loosening up, and the church starts considering all kinds of modernization things and says maybe we don't have to have services in Latin anymore, maybe we don't have to do this anymore, maybe we can get rid of limbo finally. You know, there's a whole lot of opening up and letting some light in. When the subject came to birth control, abortion, celibacy of the priesthood, the male-only priesthood, the Pope said, no, we're not going to talk about those things. And in fact, was it Pope John, who was around Vatican II, appointed a council. The council said, yeah, we could finally, open this up and maybe not have another Galileo moment and actually say that birth control is okay. The Pope single-handedly rejected that, appointed another council that was more loaded with conservatives to present back to him. They presented back to him recommending some changes. And even then he said, no, we're going to do that. So if you're listening carefully, you know that all of the issues there in that little basket of birth control, abortion, male priesthood, blah, 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 all fall under the category of patriarchy. Yes. So the whole basket of issues surrounding patriarchy in the Roman Catholic Church have just been off limits to any sort of enlightenment or reform for forever, really. I mean, I don't know of a case where the Roman Catholic Church ever really, modified their approach to patriarchy, because it is so central to their authority structure that there's just fear that if you say, oh, no, we don't want patriarchy anymore, there wouldn't be a Roman Catholic Church anymore because they're just built on that. I mean, does that make sense to people? It's just, it's an argument from tradition on the part of Pius IX's case that wasn't even really the tradition. In other words, there's no biblical or theological or historical or any sort of evidence given in any of the Pius IX's writings to make a case for these things. He just declared that basically this is the truth and always has been, because I said so. So that's the Roman Catholic side of things. And more recent surveys since the 60s, pretty consistently, just a little less than half of Roman Catholics in the United States actually support the church's leadership on this. So it is the position of the Catholic leadership that birth control is wrong and abortion is wrong and life begins at conception and all of that stuff. And it's only shared by about half the Catholics on the street. Okay. Now we're going to get into where things get muddy because the evangelicals and the Catholics kind of join forces. I should add to the discussion of the Catholics that the general history of the 1960s, when things kind of opened up in our country around the subject of abortion, there was states and the federal government started talking about getting rid of laws outlawing abortion. The only active opposition came from the Roman Catholic Church. And they formed a committee called the Pro-Life Committee. And that's when they coined the term pro-life, and which is our author applauds as a good political sleight of hand thing, because with that phrase, you change the focus of the abortion question from the mother to the fetus. The well-being of women has had nothing to do with the Catholic position on abortion all this time. So also, what I had sort of forgotten is that at that time, you had modern medicine coming finally to maybe coming up with better ways to do childbirth. You had a lot of interest in that, and you had the possibility of safe abortion, kind of comes along at that point. So, and there was a great deal of interest in birth defects. And I remember the March of Dimes for birth defects, when we were in grade school. And the thalidomide scandal was kind of fresh in people's memories, that this really strong understanding that things can go wrong during pregnancy and childbirth, and that ending of pregnancy is sometimes the appropriate thing to do, and that having state laws that ban that completely, even when there's health issues involved, were inhumane. And pretty much every state, almost all the states, loosened up their laws around abortion. The who's who of what happened at that point is really kind of amazing now. I mean, Ronald Reagan signed a bill into law in California making pretty much all abortion legal in California. The Southern Baptist Church endorsed Roe versus Wade when it happened in '72. I mean, it was quite a national movement to make it acceptable for safe clinical abortions to be available to women. As I say, the only real opposition came from Roman Catholic celibate priests who claimed to know all about that stuff. I don't know. Anyway, but the other thing that happened then, late 60s into the 70s, into the 80s, is backlash against the civil rights movement and all the other progressive things that had happened during the 50s and 60s and 70s. There started to be pushback, and the pushback came from the R word, race. When it really got down to it, evangelical Christians started objecting most strongly to government interference, government regulation of their private schools that they were trying to create to keep their kids from having to go to school with black children. And at that point, somebody said, we could, there was the Republican Party was moving toward really being kind of anti-big government, anti-federal government especially, and definitely kind of anti-civil rights and anti-desegregation. But they couldn't really lead with that because civil rights was kind of a positive theme in American life still. And somebody figured out that if you hook the white evangelicals up with Catholics on the abortion issue, and you put the abortion issue out front and center as your leading thing, you can make all of that opposition to equality and enlightenment and modernism look like a moral crusade similar to abolitionism or whatever. So all of a sudden you're going to white Christians and saying, yeah, we know you don't like, desegregation and government regulation and all of that, but let's focus on stopping the slaughter of the innocents. Let's talk about rights. Let's talk about rights the way the civil rights people do, but let's talk about it related to the unborn. And so it became sort of a flip-flop issue of a way of kind of trying to stake out a moral high ground using the culture war issues while actually then actually learning to demonize the left. So I mean that was a huge part of it, was if you can convince yourself that liberals and Democrats were baby killers, then you had permission to reject everything that they stood for. So war on poverty, yeah, it's the baby killers that want to do that, the communist, socialist baby killers. Trying to make life better in any way using government power, no, that's communist, socialist, baby killer stuff. So to my mind, that's just my opinion, I think that what white Christian evangelicals began to hear regularly on Fox News and on Rush Limbaugh and other places, as well as at church on Sunday, was that that not only was God a Republican, but Satan is a Democrat, and early 80s, I would say, late 70s, early 80s was when it started. It's been going on ever since. A few years ago, I somehow got my email for a while on Jim Jordan's email list, fundraising email list. I don't know how that happened. It's just one of those magical internet things. But I've read these and was just trying to get the flavor of them. And the one that really stood out in my mind is in a fundraising appeal, Jim Jordan saying, remember, they oppose everything we value. It doesn't even say who they and we is. It's just like, you need to send us money to elect Republicans because those other people are opposed to everything that we think is important. without even, delineating any of those things. So there's no looking for common ground there. There's just the demonization of the other side. And so once you're able to do that, then you're able to get behind all kinds of policy things and blame poverty on the poor and blame unemployment on the unemployed and all of the economic stuff that goes with what the Republicans are doing because they're baby killers on the other side. So, and just another side note, I just not too long ago I saw on some blog where somebody had solicited comments specifically from people that had voted for Trump in the past and weren't planning to do it this time. This might have been on Kristen Dumez's side, I don't remember, but and what I found interesting about this is a number of them said, I voted for Trump in 16, but not in 20, and something along the lines of after January 6th, I vowed I would never vote for Trump again. But then they would go on to say, but I can't bring myself to vote for Joe Biden and I think it's a really important part of the current political landscape is to understand that, and I don't think Democrats get this, they think that if Trump does something really so outrageous that his supporters leave him, that they'll vote for a Democrat. That's two different things. They could get totally fed up with what Trump's doing, probably would just stay home, worst case. But it's just, there's that divide, that demonization of the other side just doesn't allow that. And abortion is front and center of that. And also helpful to note that all these culture war issues can be put in that basket we call patriarchy, because you can't, the white evangelical positions, along with the Catholic positions, emphasize men's role over women. Can't have transgender people because then you don't know what they are and you don't know where on the chain of being they go if it's not clear. We don't like theys. There's no place on the chain of being for a they. So that's really makes people uncomfortable. Probably much more than people being homosexual did. And so, yeah, now we have a culture war led by abortion. What else I got here? So, yes, it's a political issue masquerading as a moral crusade. That's my sentence. That didn't come from the book, but that's why people who try to say something reasonable about abortion. Well, if you really don't, if you're really trying to, decrease the number of abortions going on in this country, you might do this. You might improve childcare. You might, make it less expensive to have a child. There's a lot of things that could be done, but I think that misses the point of why the abortion issue is what it is right now. It's really not about abortion. I mean, at the grassroots, white evangelicals in the pews issue, I'm sure there are many sincere people fighting to save the unborn babies and really believing in the cause at that level, but at the levels of power, that's not what it's about. And kind of flip side of that, on the Catholic side, once the Catholic Church went, pro-life, as in saving the unborn, there were a number of Catholics who said, okay, well, let's be consistently pro-life. let's also oppose the death penalty. Let's also oppose war. Let's also do all of these other things that promote life. And they called it the seamless garment argument or something like that. Let's be consistent. And that didn't go anywhere either. So that also ignored, I think, what the importance of the abortion issue is.
And now we've moved to the childless cat ladies thing.
Yeah.
From J.D. Vance, which is not only are the communist socialist baby killers killing babies, they're making sure they don't have any. And this really resonates with Mormons who believe that when you have a child, you're freeing a soul from spirit prison, which is why having a baby at 14 is really pretty good. I mean, they won't say it out loud, but they'll say, yeah, another baby freed from spirit prison and ready to marry some man and go off. And, well, I'm not going to go where they go, but this is where we're going now. I don't know what to make of it, but it's the next step somehow.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the hang-up with the childlessness is there, but
I heard a right-winger say, it's all right for Kamala to be childless if she would just announce that the ideal family consists of a man and a woman and children.
yeah, and there is a few paragraphs in the book about how patriarchy works differently in the Catholic Church than it does with the white evangelicals. And in the white evangelicals, it's all about the family and the hierarchy within the family. And then led by the toxic masculinity, he quotes Jesus and John Wayne in the book to make that point. It's that family structure and that.
And the Catholics, how is it different with the Catholics?
Well, the Catholic.
Or the church?
Catholic patriarchy is more tied up with the authority structure of the church. With the priests, the all-male celibate priests in charge of reproduction and women and all of those things.
You're not supposed to read the Bible yourself.
Well, no.
They'll read it and interpret it for you.
Yeah.
A lot of it's like a camel's nose under the tent. It's an analogy of the camel's nose under the tent. If you would, in all of that bucket of stuff that you're talking about with, birth control and abortion and patriarchy, hierarchy of how important men are, celibacy. If most people in America believe in birth control, most Catholics in America believe in birth control, which is specifically something the Catholic Church doesn't go along with. But if the Catholic Church would go along with that, whoops, there's one thing in that bucket that now they've made an exception to. They've opened the door to considering all of it. So they can't look at any of it. And they just close their eyes and keep it that way.
And yet they can separate out abortion from war and other kinds of killing.
Because war and other kinds of killing don't affect the patriarchy. Exactly. Yeah, and then the all-male priesthood is a huge part of that too. I mean, I suspect a large majority of American Catholics would like to see women priests as well. I don't remember seeing numbers on that recently, but and yet conservative Catholics can be dangerous things, which is kind of what we have running the Supreme Court, right? Anybody remember off the top of your head how many of the 6 conservative justices are Catholic? 6. All 6 of them? Amy Coney Barrett was sort of a mixed evangelical Catholic sort of background. I think Clarence Thomas is Catholic, right? I don't, Roberts and the young guys, Kavanaugh, I think they're all Catholics. Yeah. So,
See, one thing you haven't mentioned is that the right wing believes some, if not all, forms of birth control work by preventing implantation. The egg is fertilized, but it's not implanted in the uterus, so that's an abortion. So that's why we need to outlaw birth control.
yeah, I think it has generally more to do with the notion that that God is involved, that there's an ensoulment thing that happens. And it has to happen at some point, so let's just pick conception as the place where it happens, even though that makes no scientific sense whatsoever. As one author I read said, well, what about identical twins? Does God put two souls in one cell at that point? How does that work? Anyway, I was going somewhere with that. I forgot where it was. Oh, I researched at one point. I said, well, just in nature in general, how many fertilized eggs result in live births of babies? And it's a really hard thing to research, but people seem to have a consensus around 25%, that so if God is putting souls in every fertilized egg, out of every 100 souls, 75 of them are aborted at some point in the process by God. I mean, and the other part of that guess is that probably about the availability of voluntary abortion, voluntary miscarriage, might move that number by maybe 5%. So, it might be 75% are born without, voluntary abortion being in the picture. Maybe only 70% are. So the number of abortions per live birth is really a small factor of that. There are vastly more miscarriages by natural or just failure to implant, failure to, there's a lot of points of failure in that process, and a lot of them happen before anybody knows there was a pregnancy at all. And so that's why those numbers are all sort of guesses, but that's what people think.
And do we know if there have been more abortions or fewer abortions since the Dobbs decision?
I think people are arguing over that already. And some say it's pretty clear that there have been fewer in certain states that have put really strong restrictions in, but more in their neighboring states. And so it's really hard to pin that down. I wanted to add one more slide. We'll give it this like 5 minutes. I wanted to add this, particularly after last week's discussion where people were like, we were watching that video from the Baptist pastor named Rauschenbusch. He was talking about what progressive churches can do to get involved and make a difference. And I think there's room for Christians who are pro-choice, for lack of a better term, pro-free will kind of works, but opposed to restrictions on abortion to make a case for why we believe what we do and why we don't think that goes along with Christian teaching and is not a Christian thing to do. And so I started a list, and we can work on this and maybe add some down the road, but Jesus listened to women. I love I think the last sermon you did on, was it the woman at the well a few months back, where, all the men who had been accusing her of horrible things wandered off, and Jesus stayed there and asked her questions and talked to her. There's a few stories like that in the Gospels that I hear people nitpicking those stories. Well, Jesus didn't say what she was doing wasn't sinful, and blah, 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 but all of those stories have a woman accused of something by men, and the men bring her, and they want Jesus to help them condemn what she did. And in every case, Jesus is like, let me talk to her. He very much takes the woman's side and is much more interested in the hypocrisy and judgmentalism of the men as being bad things than he is in telling the woman that what she did was bad things. I think those stories are very relevant to this argument. And then that's kind of 1 and 2. Number 3 is Christianity has a long history of getting involved in moral issues as moral issues and trying to get society to be more moral, which I think we can all agree is generally a good thing if we've got good intentions about how we're defining what's moral. When the church has ventured into political, it's gotten hairy, and it's gotten really messy, and it's gotten, and it generally things go south. Although in a few cases, when the church got involved in, say, abolitionism, that ultimately ended in the end of slavery, and that's probably a good thing. Although it's worth pointing out that there really wasn't a good Christian abolition movement until it was in the North, and it was after slavery was no longer around in the North, and it was a case kind of like abortion of people who getting on their high horse against a moral wrong, knowing that it didn't really affect them personally. I mean, that sort of anyway, won't go too far on that, but what do you got?
When I was growing up in a liberal Presbyterian church, you really didn't see politics involved. It was all moral issues. And I think back then, up until recently, really, churches really couldn't get involved, as I understood it, with political issues because of tax reasons, that their tax exemption would be taken away. And somehow that's changed. And I don't know what changed, the tax law or just, it hasn't changed, but it seems like especially evangelical Christian churches are much more involved with political issues and telling their members to vote this way or that way. And whereas I never saw that as a kid growing up.
Right, same here. And the laws haven't changed. It's just, they're just pushing the limits and doing what they do until they can't get away with it anymore. But I think the message to us is we can get as political as we want. Nobody's going to say anything about it because they'd have to go after them first. So, what were the issues? Gambling, drinking, chocolate, smoke. Child labor, okay.
Actually, churches have been involved in politics before. When I was a teenager, we belonged to the rump of a church that had been deserted by Carl McIntyre and his Bible Presbyterians, which became a national pro-Nazi movement.
Nazi Presbyterians, yeah. I think there's also some interesting parallels with the temperance movement, which got kind of pushed and pushed and pushed until it got a majority to pass a constitutional amendment outlawing alcohol. And that's just such a classic example of overreach when the dog actually catches the car. You know, it's and that's what's so odd about the pro-life stuff is it's not majority, and I think I keep coming back to that it's not. I don't believe it's always true that the majority is right. Even though we have a democracy where what the majority wants rules. But all of this culture war stuff and the crazy that's going on with today's Republican Party is all about preserving minority rule. It's not about persuading people who disagree with them to agree with them so that they build up to a majority so that they can change the country kind of the way you do in a democracy, which is you get 51% of the people to agree with you, and then you can change the country. This is all kind of a lot of crazy stuff around promoting minority positions. I mean, and so you've got a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court making positions that clearly a minority of Americans agree with. And they got there by shenanigans. I mean, they should call it the McConnell Court. I mean, it's, people give Donald Trump credit for the current Supreme Court, but it was Mitch McConnell that really allowed it to happen, really caused it to happen. So anyway, my point was that when the current pro-life movement got totally focused on Roe versus Wade, they're really putting the political ahead of the moral. And it really led to a lot of ends justify the means kind of thinking. And I think mostly churches have always understood that making a moral case is good. You can do that, that's what we do. Let's promote this idea, but without getting into like legislation to enforce our moral position. Once you get into the legislation realm, things get messy, and you have to make compromises, and you have, So with Roe v. Wade, the focus became totally on the law, the Supreme Court decision, law, and the morality underneath it was kind of like, no, we don't care about that. We just want to see Roe v. Wade go away. And so that sort of turns the traditional way churches get involved with moral issues on its head. And that's kind of why we're in this mess today. And my last point was just that, if you're making a case against laws restricting abortion, it's not hard to document all the ways those laws do more harm than good. And we've seen it with IVF, and we've seen it with OBGYNs leaving red states, and health outcomes going down for areas where there aren't as many OBGYNs. And so lots and lots of ways to make that case.
I read a magazine called The Week. Some of you know that my husband got started on it about 20 years ago, and we've been reading it. And just the other day, one of the little blurbs was 1/4 of the OBGYNs in Idaho have left because they're afraid to do anything. And I mean, my heart just tears me apart because I know there are people that are suffering really real things.
And meanwhile, one of the worst tragedies in our country is that there remains a large gap in health outcomes between white women's maternity and black women's maternity. And where's the moral outrage over that? I don't know. Thanks for staying. We're over time. And we're, next thing we do will probably be around Poverty by America sometime in September. So hopefully you're all reading. Thank you. It is.